Six men walked into a conference room in Kuwait City in October 1973. No weapons, no uniforms, no army behind them. And within 90 days, they had done something no military force in history had ever managed to do. They broke the American economy. Not with bombs, not with missiles, with oil. And while 60 million Americans were lining up at gas stations, waiting hours just for the right to buy fuel, a small group of people who understood one single principle were quietly getting rich off the wreckage. This is that principle, and once you understand it, you will never think about your money the same way again. To understand the weapon, you have to understand the target. January 1973. America is the most powerful economy on the planet. The post-war boom is still humming. The middle class is the envy of the world. Factories are running. Highways are full. The American dream is still something people genuinely believe in, not as a slogan, but as a lived daily reality. And underneath all of it, running through every single part of the economy like blood through a body, is oil. Not expensive oil, dirt cheap oil. $3 a barrel. Think about that for a second. Adjusted for today, that's roughly what you'd pay for a cup of coffee, for enough crude oil to fill 3 bathtubs. Americans were burning through 17 million barrels of it every single day. More than any nation on earth. More than the next 3 largest consuming countries put together. Every factory ran on it. Every truck delivering goods across the country needed it. Every furnace heating a home in winter burned it. Every piece of plastic was made from it. Every acre of farmland growing food was fertilized with chemicals derived from it. The entire physical infrastructure of American prosperity was built on the assumption that oil would always be cheap and always be available. But here was the crack in the foundation. The detail that Washington knew about but refused to confront. By 1973, for the first time since World War II, America could no longer produce enough oil to meet its own consumption. The most powerful nation on earth had quietly become dependent on foreign suppliers, specifically Arab nations in the Persian Gulf, for the single resource its economy could not function without. Economists had warned about this for a decade. Geologists had mapped it out in precise technical detail. Congressional reports had documented it. And every president from Eisenhower to Nixon had looked at those warnings and made the same calculation. The Arab producers need the revenue too much. They wouldn't dare cut us off. Their own economies depend on oil sales. It will never happen. That assumption held for 25 years. It died on a Saturday morning in October 1973. October 6, 1973. Egypt and Syria launch a coordinated surprise attack on Israel, the Yom Kippur War. Israel, caught completely off guard, starts taking heavy losses and calls Washington for emergency military aid. Nixon says yes. American cargo planes begin landing in Tel Aviv on October 14th loaded with tanks, missiles, and ammunition. The Arab oil-producing nations are watching, and they interpret what they see not as a military decision, but as an economic declaration of war. So they respond with the one weapon America had convinced itself would never be used. October 17th, 1973. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries makes the announcement that stops the world. They will cut oil production by 5% every single month, every month, until their political demands are met. And to the United States, the Netherlands, and any country that supported Israel in the conflict, the oil will not just be reduced. It will stop. Completely. No negotiation, no tariff, no price adjustment. A total embargo. A complete cutoff of the single commodity the American economy physically could not replace, could not substitute, and could not survive without. The weapon nobody believed in had just been fired, and America had no defense. What happened next did not unfold slowly. It was immediate. It was violent. And it touched every single person in the country regardless of their income, their profession, or their politics. Within 3 weeks of the embargo announcement, oil went from $3 a barrel to $5, then $8, then $12, a 400% increase in under 90 days. Nothing in the peacetime American economy had ever moved that fast. At the pump, prices doubled, then tripled. Then gas stations started running out entirely. Owners padlocked their pumps. Handwritten signs appeared taped to doors all across the country. No gas today. Some stations stopped accepting cash and switched to credit only. Others stopped serving out-of-state plates. Others just closed. The federal government stepped in with rationing. Odd license plate numbers could buy fuel on odd calendar days, even plates on even days. The lines stretched for miles. People were sitting in their cars for 3, 4, 5 hours just to reach a pump that might already be empty by the time they got there. Fistfights broke out in gas lines in California, in New Jersey, in Ohio. In some states, gas station attendants started carrying firearms to protect themselves. In others, local police had to stand guard at the pumps to maintain order. This was not a third world country in a war zone. This was the United States of America in 1973. Richard Nixon did what governments always do when they haven't prepared for a crisis. He reached for the tool that looks helpful and makes things worse. He froze the retail price of gasoline to keep it affordable for consumers. It was a disaster. When you freeze the selling price of something below what it actually costs to source, suppliers stop supplying. Gas stations that were paying the new higher wholesale prices for fuel but were legally prohibited from charging customers enough to cover those costs simply stopped selling. They couldn't make money, so they shut the pumps. The shortages got dramatically worse. The medicine was more toxic than the disease. By December 1973, the entire economy was visibly breaking down. The national speed limit was slashed to 55 miles per hour to conserve fuel. Major factories cut shifts. Airlines canceled routes. Across American cities, Christmas lights were turned off, entire streets going dark, as a fuel-saving measure ordered by local governments. And the stock market, already weakening before the embargo hit, began a collapse that would not stop for over a year. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell from a peak of 1051 in January 1973 to a bottom of 577 by December 1974, a 45% decline. But that number doesn't capture the full destruction because it doesn't account for the inflation that was raging at the same time. In real purchasing power terms, the loss was closer to 60%. An American with $1,000 in a diversified stock portfolio in January 1973 had roughly $4,000 in real purchasing power by the end of 1974. Bonds, which are supposed to be the safe conservative choice, were being annihilated just as badly. When inflation runs above 10% and your bond pays 6%, you are losing 4% of your purchasing power every single year, guaranteed, while believing you are being responsible. Bond investors weren't just failing to make money, they were losing money in real terms while patting themselves on the back for their caution. Cash savings were gutted. A dollar put in the bank in 1973 bought approximately 60 cents worth of goods by 1975. Every month the crisis continued, the punishment for holding cash intensified. And then there were the people the history books barely mention, the ones who took the deepest wound of all. Fixed income retirees, men and women who had spent 30, 40 years working, saving every paycheck, contributing to pensions, following every rule the post-war financial system had handed them. Their retirement income had been calculated in pre-crisis dollars. A pension of $800 a month was comfortable in 1972. By 1975, that same $800 barely covered groceries and utility bills. In some cases, not even that. These were people who had done everything right. They had not speculated, they had not gambled, they had saved, they had planned, they had trusted the system. The system didn't protect them. This is the pattern that has repeated itself in every major inflationary crisis, in every country, across every century of recorded financial history. The people who follow the conventional rules of prudence and caution are almost always the most exposed when the rules themselves change without warning. But here is what the newspapers weren't reporting. Here is what the evening news wasn't saying while it showed footage of angry drivers sitting in gas lines. 4 specific asset classes were doing the opposite of everything else. While the Dow was losing half its value, while pension funds were melting, while 60 million Americans were burning hours of their lives in fuel queues, these 4 things were climbing. Quietly, then dramatically, then spectacularly. And the people who held them weren't geniuses. They weren't insiders. They weren't getting secret tips from government contacts. They simply understood a structural principle about what happens to money during a supply crisis. A principle that was not new in 1973, had been visible for centuries, and was about to be proven correct in the most dramatic possible way. Let's go through all four. 2 years before the embargo, on August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon made a decision in the White House that most Americans barely noticed at the time, but that would define the next decade of financial history. He severed the last remaining link between the US dollar and gold. Before that date, foreign governments could walk up to the US Treasury and exchange $35 for 1 ounce of gold. That exchange rate had been the anchor of the entire global financial system since the end of World War II. It was the promise underneath every dollar in circulation, that the paper was backed by something real, something finite, something that couldn't be printed. After August 15, 1971, that promise was gone. The dollar was now backed by nothing except the word of the United States government and whatever trust the world chose to place in it. For 2 years, the world held its breath and watched nervously. Maybe it would be fine. Maybe a dollar backed by American political credibility was enough. Then the oil embargo hit, and the answer came back fast. In January 1973, gold was trading at $65 an ounce. By December 1974, it had reached $195, a 200% gain in less than 2 years, in an environment where almost every other asset was losing value in real terms. The mechanics were direct and simple. When oil quadrupled, inflation surged past 10%. The purchasing power of every dollar in existence began shrinking at a pace nobody had seen since World War II. Central banks that had been holding dollar reserves started quietly converting some of those reserves back to gold bullion. European investors who had watched the Nixon shock with growing unease now had hard evidence for what they had feared. Capital poured into gold from every direction. Gold didn't rise purely out of panic or emotion. It rose because the embargo proved something fundamental and undeniable, that a currency completely untethered from any real anchor could lose value faster than any economic model had predicted, under the right conditions, in real time, in front of the entire world. And here is the detail that most retellings of this story leave out entirely, the part that should genuinely make you angry. For almost the entire duration of this gold surge, it was illegal for American citizens to own gold bullion. Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102, issued in 1933 during the Great Depression, had prohibited Americans from holding gold. That ban was not lifted until December 31, 1974, essentially after the biggest single leg of gold's crisis rally was already complete. The average American standing in the gas line, watching his savings lose value week by week, was legally prohibited by his own government from owning the single best-performing asset of the crisis he was living through. The people who captured those gains were Europeans, Arabs, anyone with offshore access to bullion markets who had positioned themselves before the crisis erupted. That was asset number 1. 3 remained. The second asset that thrived during the embargo felt morally wrong at the time. In some ways it still does, but the discomfort doesn't change the math. Oil company stocks. The shares of the very corporations selling the commodity that was crippling the country, Exxon, Mobil, Texaco, Shell, Gulf Oil, Standard Oil of California, were among the best-performing investments of 1973 and 1974. Exxon reported a 59% increase in profits in 1973 alone. Mobil was up 47%. Texaco 45%. The others weren't far behind. $10,000 invested across the 5 largest American oil companies in January 1973 grew to approximately $18,000 by December 1974, a near doubling, while the broader market was losing nearly half its value. Congress convened hearings. Senators demanded explanations. The word profiteering appeared in newspaper headlines daily. The public fury was genuine and understandable. Families rationing their driving, skipping vacations, sitting in freezing homes to save heating oil, while the companies supplying that oil were posting the most profitable quarters in their history. But underneath the outrage was a structural reality that didn't care how anyone felt about it. In a supply crisis, The entity that controls the scarce supply is the only entity in the entire economy whose revenue mathematically has to go up. Everyone downstream, consumers, manufacturers, airlines, shipping companies, pays more. But the producer at the source captures that premium. Their extraction costs didn't change. The cost of getting a barrel of oil out of the ground in Texas or Louisiana in 1974 was essentially the same as it had been in 1972, but the price they received for that barrel had quadrupled. The margin didn't just improve, it exploded. This wasn't conspiracy, it wasn't manipulation, it was basic supply and demand arithmetic playing out in the most visible possible way. And the investors who understood that arithmetic, who bought energy equities before or during the embargo rather than panicking out of them, didn't just survive the crisis. They used the crisis as a wealth-building event. The lesson remains deeply uncomfortable. In a supply crisis for an essential commodity, you do not want to be the consumer, you want to be the supplier. That was asset number 2. The third asset that survived the oil embargo is the one that surprises people most when they first hear it. Agricultural land, dirt, acres of Iowa cornfields. In 1973 alone, American farmland values rose 25%. In Iowa, the heartland of American grain production, the price per acre climbed from $340 in 1972 to $480 by 1974. And that was just the beginning. Values kept climbing through the rest of the decade, eventually pushing above $2,000 per acre by the early 1980s. That's a near 6-fold increase in roughly 10 years. Most people's first reaction is, what does farmland have to do with an oil crisis? Everything. Absolutely everything. Modern industrial farming is not a natural process. It is an oil-dependent industrial process that happens to take place outdoors. Diesel fuel powers every tractor, every harvesting machine, every piece of equipment on every farm in America. The fertilizers that make modern crop yields possible are manufactured from natural gas and petroleum derivatives. The pesticides protecting those crops are petrochemical products. The trucks carrying the harvest from rural Iowa to urban grocery stores run on diesel. From the moment a seed goes into the ground to the moment food reaches a consumer's plate, petroleum is involved at nearly every stage. When oil quadrupled, the cost of producing food quadrupled with it. But here is the crucial difference between food and almost every other commodity. The demand for food does not respond to price increases the way demand for other things does. Economists have a term for this. They call food a perfectly inelastic necessity. When gasoline gets expensive, people drive less. When flights get expensive, people travel less. When luxury goods get expensive, people buy less. The demand adjusts downward in response to the higher price. When food gets expensive, people still eat. They have no choice. They pay more or they go hungry, and they pay more. The result was that food prices rose faster than production costs did. Farm revenues surged, and farmland, the finite physical asset that produces the food, became the most sought-after real asset in the entire country almost overnight. There was a second force driving farmland prices up, one that connects directly back to gold. Both gold and farmland share a fundamental characteristic that most financial assets don't have. They are real, physical, finite. You cannot manufacture more farmland. You cannot print more acres. A central bank cannot issue a new supply of Iowa topsoil. And in an inflationary crisis, which is exactly what the oil embargo created, capital instinctively flows away from paper and toward things that are physically real, productively useful, and genuinely limited in supply. This was not a new discovery in 1973. 50 years earlier, during the Weimar hyperinflation in Germany, farmland had been one of the only asset classes that preserved generational wealth through the collapse. Families who owned productive agricultural land came through the hyperinflation intact. Families who held paper savings, paper bonds, and paper currency were financially destroyed. Different continent, different century, different crisis. Identical outcome. That was asset number 3. The fourth asset is the one that gets overlooked most completely. It doesn't feel like an investment. It doesn't feel exciting. But in terms of pure wealth preservation during the crisis, it may have been the most accessible and the most powerful of all 4. Sound foreign currencies. While the US dollar was losing 25% of its purchasing power through a combination of inflation and money printing, a small number of foreign currencies were doing something entirely different. They were strengthening. The Swiss franc, issued by a small neutral country with no meaningful oil dependency, minimal government debt, and a central bank with an institutional commitment to monetary discipline that bordered on religious devotion, the Swiss franc gained against the dollar throughout the entire crisis period. The West German Deutschmark did the same. West Germany had rebuilt its entire post-war economy on export competitiveness, fiscal conservatism, and an almost obsessive institutional fear of inflation, a fear born directly from the lived national memory of Weimar hyperinflation, which had destroyed an entire generation's savings within a single decade. The Bundesbank did not print money to manage political problems. It maintained discipline, and the Deutschmark reflected that discipline. The numbers are striking in their simplicity. An American who converted $100,000 into Swiss francs in January 1973 and then did absolutely nothing. No investing, no trading, no financial sophistication of any kind, just held a different currency in a bank account, would have held the equivalent of approximately $140,000 in purchasing power by 1975. A 40% gain from doing nothing, except choosing which currency to hold their cash in. The principle underneath this is straightforward once you see it. When a government responds to a crisis by inflating its currency, whether through direct money printing, through deficit spending, or through suppressing interest rates below the inflation rate, the damage is denominated in that currency. It only affects people whose wealth is measured in that currency. If your savings are held in a currency that is not being debased, you are outside the blast radius entirely. The destruction happens around you, not to you. The Swiss franc worked in 1973 for the same reasons it had worked during both world wars, through the stagflation of the late 1970s, through the European debt crises of the 1990s and 2000s. It was the currency of a country that consistently, institutionally, refused to sacrifice monetary credibility for short-term political convenience. Not every foreign currency worked. The British pound collapsed under the weight of Britain's own energy crisis layered on top of chronic fiscal mismanagement. The Italian lira disintegrated. The currencies of nations that were both heavily oil-dependent and fiscally undisciplined were destroyed right alongside the dollar. In some cases, worse. The lesson was never simply hold foreign currencies. The lesson was more specific and more demanding. Hold the currencies of governments that will not destroy their own money to manage a crisis. The difference in outcome between the right foreign currency and the wrong one was the difference between a 40% gain and a catastrophic loss. That was the fourth asset. Now here is the part that transforms this from interesting financial history into something genuinely urgent. It happened again. January 1979. Tehran, Iran. The Shah of Iran, one of America's closest and most important allies in the Middle East, and the ruler of the world's fourth largest oil-producing nation, is forced to flee his own country. The Iranian Revolution succeeds, and Iranian oil production, which had been running at 6 million barrels per day, collapses towards zero in a matter of weeks. 6 million barrels, roughly 10% of global supply, gone, overnight. Oil prices doubled from $15 a barrel to $39 by the spring of 1980, and then watch what happened to the four assets. Gold had been trading at $226 an ounce at the start of 1979. By January 21, 1980, it had hit $850, a 276% gain in a single year. Energy company stocks hit record profit levels for the second time in 6 years. Iowa farmland prices pushed past $1,500 per acre as the decade-long agricultural land boom continued without interruption. The Swiss franc and the Deutschmark strengthened against the dollar again as American inflation surged back into double digits. 4 for 4, same assets, same direction, different crisis, different decade, identical pattern. Then it happened a third time. September 1980, Iraq invades Iran. And as the war drags on, both sides begin targeting the other's oil shipments. What became known as the Tanker War saw 451 ships attacked in the Persian Gulf between 1981 and 1988. Massive oil tankers, Vessels carrying hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude through the Strait of Hormuz became military targets. Missiles, mines, helicopter gunships. Sailors died. Oil burned on the water. Insurance premiums for Gulf shipping became almost prohibitive. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, the single bottleneck through which 1/5 of the world's entire oil supply flowed, became the most dangerous waterway on the planet. The United States Navy eventually deployed to escort tankers through the strait in Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since World War II. A superpower was committing its military forces to keeping oil moving through a 21-mile gap. And still, every time a major tanker was struck and oil prices spiked, the four assets responded the same way. Gold up, energy equities up, farmland continued its climb, capital flowed into strong foreign currencies. 3 different crises, 3 different causes, 3 completely different geopolitical contexts, 15 years apart. Same 4 assets, same result, every single time. This is not a coincidence. It's not luck. And it's not complicated once you understand the mechanism underneath it. An oil shock does one specific thing to a modern economy. It forces the cost of energy up, which forces the cost of everything that depends on energy up, which puts the central bank in an impossible position. It can let inflation run and watch the currency lose value. Or it can raise interest rates high enough to fight inflation and watch the economy contract into recession. In every case from 1973 through the 1980s, governments chose a painful, ineffective combination of both, tolerating some inflation while implementing some rate hikes, and produced the worst possible outcome, stagflation, rising prices and a shrinking economy at the same time. In that environment, every conventional asset gets destroyed by one force or another. Stocks fall because corporate earnings collapse when consumers are stretched thin and input costs are rising. Bonds lose real value because the fixed interest payments they offer are eaten alive by inflation running higher than the coupon rate. Cash loses purchasing power directly as the currency is debased. Real estate freezes because mortgage rates spike to levels that eliminate most buyers from the market. The 4 assets that consistently survived share one defining characteristic. They do not require economic growth to maintain their value. Gold exists completely outside the financial system. Its value is not derived from corporate earnings or economic expansion. It is a store of value that has been recognized as such across every culture and every century of human civilization. Energy equities benefit directly from the crisis itself. Higher oil prices mean higher revenues for producers, regardless of what the broader economy is doing. Farmland produces food that people must purchase regardless of whether the GDP is rising or falling, and its physical finiteness means it cannot be inflated away. Sound foreign currencies simply reflect the monetary decisions of governments that choose not to destroy their money, and those decisions protect holders from the damage being done to everyone else. When the system breaks, the things that exist outside the system are the things that survive. This principle was not invented in 1973. It was visible during the Weimar hyperinflation. It was visible during the Soviet collapse in 1991. It was visible during the Argentine corralito in 2001 when the government froze bank accounts and the people who held real assets outside the financial system kept their wealth, while the people who trusted the system lost everything. The specific assets that perform best change slightly with each era and each crisis. The underlying principle has never changed. October 16, 1973. Amarillo, Texas. Roy Tillman hangs up the fuel nozzle, wipes his hands on a rag, watches the Chevrolet Impala ease back onto Route 66, and disappear into the Texas afternoon. 29 cents a gallon, $5 for a full tank. Everything feels completely normal. Tomorrow the embargo will be announced. Within a month there will be a line of cars stretching around the block at Roy's station. Within 2 months he'll be padlocking the pumps 3 days a week because there is simply nothing left to sell. He doesn't know any of that yet. The people who came through what followed, not just intact but wealthier, were not clairvoyants. They did not predict the embargo. They did not foresee the Iranian Revolution. They had no advance warning of the tanker war. What they had was an understanding of a structural principle that has held true across every inflationary crisis in modern financial history. When the supply of something essential gets weaponized, 4 categories of assets survive. Every time, without exception, across every decade and every country where this pattern has played out. The pattern does not care whether you believe in it. It only cares whether you are positioned for it before it begins. Because by the time it's obvious, it's already too late.